Hello, students. So I'm actually going to just give you some of the highlights from HR 40. I'm going to email it to you. It's a short breakdown of the bill that was, it's 14 pages. The bill that was introduced by Congresswoman Sheila Jackson Lee. The purpose, so it says it's the bill to address the fundamental injustice, cruelty, brutality, and inhumanity of slavery in the United States and the 13 American colonies between 1619 and 1865, and to establish a commission to study and consider a national apology and proposal for reparations for the institution of slavery. Its subsequent de jure and de facto racial and economic discrimination against African Americans and the impact of those forces on living African Americans, to make recommendations to the Congress on appropriate remedies and for other purposes. And then it says, let's see, this act may be cited as a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans Act. Findings and the purpose. It says approximately 4 million Africans and their descendants were enslaved in the United States and colonies that became the United States from 1619 to 1865. The institution of slavery was constitutionally and statutorily sanctioned by the government of the United States from 1789 through 1865. The slavery that flourished in the United States constituted an immoral and inhumane deprivation of Africans' life, liberty, African citizenship rights, and cultural heritage, and denied them the fruits of their own labor. A preponderance of scholarly, legal, community evidentiary documentation and popular culture markers constitute the basis for inquiry into the ongoing effects of the institution of slavery and its legacy of persistent systematic structures of discrimination on living African Americans and society in the United States. It says, following the abolition of slavery, the United States government at the federal, state, and local continued to perpetuate, condone, and often profit from practices that continue to brutalize and disadvantage African Americans, including sharecropping, convict leasing, Jim Crow, redlining, unequal education, and disproportionate treatment at the hands of the criminal justice system. So these are all issues that we've actually talked about in this course, as we've talked about the experience of Black folks coming here from 1619 as being the first slaves. And then we talked about, the Civil War and like even the Dred Scott case leading up to the Civil War, how he wasn't considered a citizen. And then you have the Civil War, and then you have the passage of 13th, 14th, 15th Amendment. So 13th Amendment gets rid of slavery. And then you have the 14th Amendment, equal protection under the law, the 15th Amendment, the right to vote. But you still have issues as far as Jim Crow laws, black codes, and then we're going to get into the case for reparations, where he talks about, Ta-Nehisi Coates talks about the experience of Clyde Ross, who's dealing with, he was a sharecropper down south, and they deal with racism of being down south. I've talked myself about my family. I have a lot of family that came from down south. They were sharecroppers. They dealt with racism. Then they come up north, and Clyde Ross comes up north. He deals with redlining, restrictive covenants. And even though he went and fought for our country, he still, and that's what you see in the history of our country time and time again. You see, we're there. We're fighting in the Revolutionary War. We're fighting in the Civil War. We're fighting in World War I, World War II, Vietnam, the Gulf War. Now we're there. We're the go-to people to do the work, and they have clear affirmative action for us when it comes to the military, but when it comes for us as a people to actually making sure that we all have equality as far as our housing, education, employment opportunities, there's still racism in America, and it's 2020, and it's unfortunate. And I know there are some people that are like bootstraps, because you're going to see, there's one video in there I sent you. This guy's like, oh, we don't need reparations and blah, blah, blah. I'm fine, and I don't want to be associated with the stigma from that, the negative stuff about being Black. And it's like, well, no, it's not a negative thing. Our ancestors were slaves. They were brought here. Some of them murdered, raped, brutalized. A lot of people survived. They survived. We built this country. But it's an injustice to be profiting off of somebody else's labor without paying for it. So the injustice needs to be remedied. The best way to do that is reparations, whether it's in the form of, I mean, it's a whole list. Cut a check, educational opportunities, employment, housing, the whole kit and caboodle. I mean, it really helps us. I've talked before about that race movie. I love that race movie. It talks about the Jesse Owens story. And I just think about, like, if in America, what if we really gave opportunities to everybody? If we were a more just society, we could, who knows, there's some child out there right now who could probably come up with a cure for the coronavirus or whatever diseases or ailments that are out there today. So the rest of it is, so this is page 3 of the HR 40. As a result of the historic and continued discrimination, African Americans continue to suffer debilitating economic, educational, and health hardships, including but not limited to nearly 1 million Black people incarcerated, an unemployment rate more than twice the current white unemployment rate, and an average of less than 1/16 of the wealth of white families, a disparity which has worsened, not improved over time. Purpose. The purpose of this act is to establish a commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans as a result of the institution of slavery, including both the transatlantic and domestic trade, which existed from 1565 in colonial Florida and from 1619 through 1865 within the other colonies that became the United States, and which included the federal and state governments which constitutionally and statutorily supported the institution of slavery. The de jure and de facto discrimination against freed slaves and their descendants from the end of the Civil War to the present, including economic, political, educational, and social discrimination. The lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery and the discrimination described in the paragraphs 1 and 2 on living African Americans, on society in the United States, and on society. So it's Black folk, and it's just like we were reading the materials for Martin Luther King, and he was talking about what affects one of us directly can affect all of us indirectly. Slavery and the badges of slavery affect everybody. So the manner in which textual and digital instructional resources and technologies are being used to deny the inhumanity of slavery and the crime against humanity of people of African descent in the United States. And when they start talking about that, it makes me think, I took international law. We talked a lot about countries that were committing crimes against humanity and how that's wrong. Things need to be remedied. The role of Northern complicity in the Southern-based institution of slavery. So people are always talking about the South, but there were some folks in the North letting stuff go on. So the direct benefits to society institutions, public and private, including higher education, corporations, religion, and associational, and thus recommend appropriate ways to educate the American public of the Commission's findings, and thus recommend appropriate remedies and consideration of the Commission's findings on the matters described in paragraphs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 9. Submit to the Congress the result of such examination together and such with recommendations. So it gives a little bit more. There's a section that talks about establishment. There's an the Commission to study and develop reparation proposals for African Americans, hereinafter this act referred to as the Commission. Duties: the Commission shall perform the following duties: identify, compile, and synthesize the relevant corpus of evidentiary documentation of the institution of slavery, which existed within the United States and the colonies that became the United States from 1619 through 1865. The Commission's documentation examination shall include but not be limited to the facts related to the capture and procurement of Africans. We reviewed the homicide case. There's a movie about that too that talks about the Black folk that were just scooped up from Africa and brought, by the Spanish, came over here to America, and we saw how the shadiness that they had to go through. Ultimately, the court made the right decision in that case, and they were able to be repatriated back to America. So the transport of Africans to the United States and the colonies that became the United States for the purpose of enslavement, including their treatment during transport. They had, before we went to the Charles H. Wright Museum, and they had a really good, I took my nephew there, display. Like you start in a slave ship, and then it goes through the whole history, the Black experience from slavery all the way up to the present. It was amazing. I think it was like Through Their Eyes. And then I also went to the African American Museum in DC, where you go like 3 levels down, and they start from the experience of Black folks in slavery all the way up to the present moment. You actually, I'd say, probably need a couple days to go to that museum. So the sale and acquisition of Africans as chattel property in interstate and intrastate commerce, the treatment of African slaves in the colonies and the United States, including the deprivation of their freedom, exploitation of their labor, and destruction of their culture, language, religion, and families. So I know my mom often will have us watch Roots. If y'all haven't watched Roots, it's probably a good time to watch Roots. Make I don't know, you gotta watch it, but try to be calm about it, because it makes you angry, you get upset. But you gotta watch Roots, because Roots really shows you like the Black experience in America. Starts over in the motherland, brings it all the way over here. The extensive denial of humanity, sexual abuse, and chattelization of persons, the role which the federal and state governments of the United States supported the institution of slavery and constitutional and statutory provisions, including the extent to which such governments prevented, opposed, or restricted efforts of formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants to repatriate to their homeland, the federal and state laws that discriminated against formerly enslaved Africans and their descendants who were deemed United States citizens from 1868 to the present, the other forms of discrimination in the public and private sectors against freed African slaves and their descendants who were deemed United States citizens from 1868 to the present, including redlining, educational funding discrepancies, and predatory financial practices. I know there's been discussion still of that happening back, I think it was like 2008. They were talking about subprime lending, things like that. The lingering negative effects of the institution of slavery in the matters described in paragraphs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 on living African Americans and on society in the United States. Recommend appropriate ways to educate the American public of the Commission's findings. Recommend appropriate remedies in consideration of the Commission's findings on the matters described in paragraphs 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and in making such recommendations, the Commission shall address, among other issues, the following questions. This is on page 7 of this HR 40. How such recommendations comport with international standards of remedy for wrongs and injuries caused by the state that include full reparations and special measures as understood by various relevant international protocols, laws, and findings. How the government of the United States will offer a formal apology on behalf of the people of the United States for the perpetuation of gross human rights violations and crimes against humanity on African slaves and their descendants. How federal laws and policies that continue to disproportionately and negatively affect African Americans as a group and those that perpetuate the lingering effects materially and psychosocial can be eliminated. How the injuries resulting from matters described in paragraphs 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6 can be reversed, and provide appropriate policies, programs, projects, and recommendations for the purpose of reversing the injuries. How, in consideration of the Commission's findings and any form of compensation to the descendants of enslaved African is calculated. What form of compensation should be awarded, through what instrumentalities, and who should be eligible for such compensation. How, in consideration of the Commission's findings, any other forms of rehabilitation or restitution to African descendants is warranted, and what the form and scope of the measures should take. Report to Congress. The Commission shall submit a report of its findings and recommendation to the Congress no later than the date, which is 1 year after the date of the first meeting of the Commission pursuant to Section 4C. And then it goes on and talks about membership, how things are going to be laid out, the powers of the Commission. So that talks about how the hearings and the sessions will be done, administrative provisions, things of that nature. Termination is Commission shall terminate 90 days after the date on which the Commission submits its report to Congress under Section 3C. Authorization of appropriations. It says to carry out the provisions of the Act, there are authorized to be appropriated $12 million. So that is HR 40 in a nutshell. I agree with my mom. I don't know that, do we need to study it? We don't really need to study it. We know what happened. I mean, you guys have taken this course. You've seen, we've talked about some of the, not even just taking this course, for those of you, some of you have lived it, or some of you know people who have lived this experience of being Black in America and seen what it's like up close and personal. Some of you just know in your DNA, you know in your bones, we have been wronged as a people, and equity, justice demands that this wrong is corrected. You know, so that's HR 40 in a nutshell. So stay tuned. The next video we're going to talk about Ta-Nehisi Coates, the case for reparations. So everybody, again, stay safe, be blessed, remember to maintain social distancing, and I will be talking with you soon.